Okay, so we're going to go ahead and see how these videos work. I'm going to forewarn you that the microphone is very sensitive. And so even clicking on my computer to go to the next slide and whatnot, it does make noise, and even like scooching in my chair will make noises here in the classroom. So I apologize. It's the best we could do, but we'll see how this works, and hopefully this will provide you with some knowledge that I think is important, that I want to make sure that you get. It's probably in the book and some other sources, but I need to make sure that you have this foundation for when you study Indigenous people, so that way you can make some inferences, meaning that you can make some decisions and also an understanding about them. So this is kind of a part of the lecture that the regular class is going to get. Um, but it, again, like I said, it'll help you. So the first thing we need to talk about is when we say indigenous people of Kansas, what we're going to see later on is we're going to see that indigenous people that lived in Michigan, places of Ohio, Missouri, also as far as Delaware and New England area, are going to be forced to come to Kansas and be put on reservations. So when I talk about the indigenous people of Kansas, I'm talking about those people that are actually from Kansas, that are from here, that weren't forced to come here like the Shawnee. The Shawnee were forced to come here and relocate. And then eventually they'll go to Oklahoma. But these, when I say indigenous people of Kansas, we're going to be looking at those people that are actually from here. So you don't have to take Cornell notes with this. You can if you think it'll help you, or you can just go ahead and listen, follow along. It's up to you. If you do take Cornell notes, here we go. Our essential question is, what types of people lived in Kansas prior to European arrival? And so that'll help you. The very first thing that we need to talk about when we study indigenous people, specifically those in the Americas, is that there is a complete lack of sources that we know about these people. We don't have very many primary sources, and we don't have very many secondary sources. This isn't like a lot of societies like European or Chinese or Japanese, Indian or Arabic civilizations that necessarily kept a written record. These were societies that traditionally had an oral record. And because of that, a lot of what we know about these people prior to European contact is through archaeological evidence that we've been able to find and to gain a better understanding, but also some of these oral traditions. And though these groups, particularly that we're looking in Kansas, aren't necessarily wiped out like other groups that we're going to see in the Americas, from smallpox and just plain European bad habits, it's still hard to know what life was like for these people. And so there's a lot of questions and things that we have to kind of keep in mind and stay open about. Um, but some of the things that we do know that we can say about these indigenous groups in Kansas that we do have evidence about, archaeological evidence, is that there were indigenous people here, that for thousands of years people were here. And we have evidences of settlements, especially along the Kansas River. We have evidences of people, and most of these evidence, most of these settlements that we find are kind of here in northeast Kansas. So we find them in Atchison, we find them in Leavenworth, we find them in Manhattan. Um, we find them going kind of closer towards Bonner Springs along the Kansas River. We find early settlements and evidence that people were here. And then also looking in places like Wichita or even towards like Salina and even out farther western Kansas, we find evidence of people being there as well. And so we aren't sure about a lot of these people that were here um, prior to us arriving, but we do know that there were indigenous groups of people here and they were very active. Okay. So the big thing that we need to know when we talk about indigenous groups of people is that there's two types of tribes. And I'm not sure if tribes is actually probably the best word to use, but we need to note that there were two types of people here. And the first group were those called village dwellers, and that's kind of the easiest term to use. And village dwellers largely lived in the eastern part of Kansas, So kind of think east of Wichita. Um, and those people actually built permanent settlements, so permanent homes, kind of like the ones you see here. And they farm, they irrigated, they also hunt, but they built permanent settlements. And sometimes, and we're not necessarily why, but these permanent settlements would actually get up and maybe move to another location. And we see evidence of that, especially again, like along the Kansas River, we see some of those examples of those village dwellers that lived in eastern Kansas. Now, on the other end, in western Kansas, one of the things that we see is these tribes were largely nomadic, meaning that they would follow, and I just got an email, they would largely follow the migration of animals as they went from one area to the other. And we have to remember that there weren't no states here. So these migrations of people, they might start in maybe Nebraska or Colorado and go through Kansas and then even go into Oklahoma and eventually into Texas. So one of these groups that we can kind of learn about, and that may be up to you, is like the Wichita. The Wichita people were spread all the way out through Texas, through Oklahoma, and even into southern Kansas, where the city of Wichita is today, and even who it's named after. And so, even though these groups were in Kansas, they didn't necessarily work confined to these political boundaries that exist today. So, some of these groups would migrate from New Mexico into Colorado into Kansas, or they would even come from places like Idaho. So, they kind of traveled, and some of these groups would actually get into conflict over these migration patterns and chasing the food that they needed. So those are the two main groups. These are just some things that you need to know about the indigenous groups. With the assignment, make sure that you choose three of those indigenous groups. You complete the Venn diagram. So I don't think I need to explain this, but where they overlap, you need to make sure that those are things that they have in common. And then obviously the parts that don't connect, those are things that might make them different. So you can use the Kansas history book. That'll provide you with some sources you can look online. I'm going to try and put some websites that you can look at, and I'll provide you with some other handouts that are very similar to what the class has, but I don't really think that those are going to help out. So I hope this gave you at least some foundational information when talking about these groups, and we'll see how this goes.